Injustice 2 has just come out, setting a new standard for story modes in fighting games. The original Injustice was similarly well received, garnering a strong following both with competitive and casual players alike. We didn't always have it this good when it came to DC fighting games though. Just look back to the 16-bit era, and you'll see how far we've come in just a couple of decades. There have been lots of great fighting games in the past, but Justice League Task Force, sadly, was not one of them. The game's plot is fairly thin. Darkseid declares war on planet Earth, and your chosen member of the Justice League leaps into action. Since the majority of playable characters in the game are League members, the story mode explains away those fights by having the other heroes replaced by evil cyborg versions, all under the control of Darkseid. It's a bit of an awkward storyline, but it's no big deal really. What is a big deal is how poorly the game plays. There are three main culprits here: choppy animation, wonky controls, and shallow fighting mechanics. The animation in this game is very disappointing, especially considering the source material. Most moves only have a handful of frames, and movement looks stilted and awkward. Attacks feel like they have no weight behind them, and special moves are not exciting at all. That's when you can even pull them off, given how difficult the controls make it for the player. The frustration from trying to reliably string together attacks makes the game a chore to play, whether it's against the AI or a second player. The fights are also very one-dimensional. Forget about flashy combos, super moves, or anything that would make you think this was a comic book universe. Most fights are just a matter of finding the most effective button for that character and abusing it in the hopes of making the round end as soon as possible. There's no flair or fun to the fights at all, which is tragic for a game based on such a rich history of comic books. Any one of these three elements would pull the game down on its own, but in tandem, they work together to create a title that looks and plays like it should have been released in 1991, not 1995. The context here is important. 1995 had games like Tekken, Virtua Fighter 2, and Street Fighter Alpha tearing up the arcades, while home consoles had fighters like Super Street Fighter 2, TMNT Tournament Fighters, and Killer Instinct. This wasn't simply a case of Justice League being an average game. It was absolutely outclassed by so many different games in the same genre that its existence was almost pointless outside of the DC Comics license. The game was released for both the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive. Weirdly enough, there are quite a lot of differences between the two versions. Both were developed primarily by Sunsoft, with Condor assisting on the Mega Drive version, and Blizzard of all people co-developing the SNES version. The majority of changes are aesthetic ones. The backgrounds all look different. Some are the same location but drawn differently, while some characters fight in entirely different areas. The sprite work is varied, with some characters looking very similar across both consoles, whilst others, like Aquaman, look vastly different. The characters themselves seem significantly bigger on the Mega Drive screen. The in-game presentation is also completely different. Things like the menus and the character select look different across consoles, as do the cutscenes. The Super Nintendo goes for a much plainer version with the character sprite and some plain text, whilst the Mega Drive has more comic book style panels and a chunkier yellow font. Finally, the music is vastly different. As often was the case with games in this era, the SNES soundtrack is softer, with some fairly muffled sounding samples. The Mega Drive version goes to the other extreme, with quite harsh melodies and a grittier overall sound. So neither version is particularly impressive aesthetically, and it really comes down to personal taste which you find more appealing. For me personally, it's the Mega Drive version, but honestly, neither version's worth your time. There are so many other great fighting games for both consoles that you should play instead of this one. And if you really need to get your DC fix, just jump forward a few generations, pick up the Injustice games, and leave this one in the past where it belongs.